Welcome, quiet traveler, to a place where time moves slowly, where history whispers rather than shouts. Tonight, we drift backward through centuries to an age when winter refused to leave, when the sky itself seemed to forget the meaning of warmth. Settle yourself now. Let your shoulders fall. Feel the weight of the modern world slipping away like snow melting from a window pane. We're about to step into a time so cold, so persistent, that entire kingdoms bent beneath its weight. Yet somehow, quietly, people endured. The story we're about to explore is not one of battles or conquests. It is softer than that, stranger than that. It is the story of Europe's forgotten cold age and a winter that stretched across years, stealing harvests, silencing songs, and teaching humanity what it truly meant to wait. But before we slip into that frozen world together, I wonder, have you ever imagined what it would feel like to wake each morning not knowing if the sun would ever truly return? Have you considered how many meals separate comfort from desperation? How many days of cold can a community endure before hope itself begins to frost over? If these questions stir something in you, if you feel that quiet pull to wander through this frozen moment in history, gently tap the like button. And if you'd like to help this story reach more wandering souls, use the hype feature below. It's a small way to lift this forgotten winter higher into the light of the algorithm. And subscribe, won't you? So that whenever you need to slip away from the noise of now, you'll find these journeys waiting for you. Doorways into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment too if you'd like. Tell me where you are in the world right now, what time of day or night it is where you sit. Some of you may be listening in darkness, the house silent around you. Others perhaps with morning light just beginning to break. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Now, dim your lights if you haven't already. Perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle, constant hum, the kind of sound that erases the edges of thought. Adjust your pillow. Let your breathing slow. We're about to step into 14th century Europe, where the rhythm of life had become the rhythm of survival, where cold was not just weather, but a way of being. Let us begin. The year is 1316, and you are waking in darkness, not the comfortable darkness of a planned early morning, but the heavy grey darkness that seems to have no beginning and promises no end. Outside your dwelling, a modest structure of timber and wattle, its walls patched with mud and straw. The world is locked in cold. Your eyes open slowly. The air in the room carries a damp weight, pressing against your face like a cold cloth. You can see your breath, even here, even after a night of 4 bodies, sleeping close together for warmth. The hearth at the center of your single room has gone cold. The embers you banked so carefully before sleep have surrendered to the night's chill. You lie still for a moment, postponing the inevitable. Beneath you, the straw mattress, really just loose straw contained by rough cloth, has compressed into hardness. You can feel every ridge of the wooden platform beneath. Your wool blanket, woven by your own hands 2 winters ago, is damp. Everything is damp. The moisture seeps through walls, rises from the earthen floor, condenses on the underside of the thatched roof, and drips, occasionally, with a soft tap onto the packed dirt below. Beside you, your spouse breathes quietly. On the other side of the room, your 2 children sleep curled together like nested spoons, their dark hair spilling across shared cloth. The youngest, just 5 winters old, makes a small sound in sleep. Not quite a whimper, not quite a sigh. You've learned to interpret these sounds. This one means hunger, even in dreams. You are hungry too. But hunger, by now, has become something else. It is no longer the sharp, demanding sensation you remember from childhood. when missing a meal meant anticipation of the next. This hunger is different. A constant hollow ache that sits beneath your ribs and in your belly, a companion that never leaves, only occasionally grows quieter or more insistent. You have been hungry for so long that you've almost forgotten what satisfaction feels like. Almost. You rise, the cold of the floor strikes your feet immediately, not the clean cold of winter ice, but something damper, something that seeps. You wrap your cloak around yourself. This cloak was your father's, passed down when he died 2 years ago. It still smells faintly of him, of smoke and work and the particular odor of old wool that's been worn too long. The fabric is threadbare in places and you've patched it 3 times, but it's all you have. Moving quietly. You've learned not to wake the children too early, for then they wake hungry, and there is no breakfast to give them. You approach the hearth. A few sticks of wood remain in the corner. You debate. Wood is precious now. The forests are owned by the Lord, and taking from them without permission means punishment. But there are dead branches sometimes, and permission is occasionally granted. These sticks represent a morning's work from 3 days ago, scavenging in the permitted areas near the village edge. You decide to light a small fire. Just enough to take the edge off the cold, to warm your hands, to heat water, if there is any, to heat. The flint and steel are kept in a small leather pouch hung from a roof beam. Your hands shake slightly, not from nervousness, but from cold, from hunger, from the persistent weakness that has settled into your muscles over these long months. It takes several strikes before a spark catches in the dried moss you use as tinder. You blow gently, coaxing, whispering to the tiny orange glow, as if it were a living thing that might respond to kindness. The fire catches. Slowly, reluctantly, it grows. You feed it carefully, one small stick at a time. The light it brings seems impossibly precious, a small defiance against the grey world outside. As the flames build, you notice your hands. They are thinner than they should be, the skin rough and cracked, fingernails broken and dirty. There is a sore on your thumb that won't heal, the kind of small wound that would have been nothing in better times, but now persists, angry and red at its edges. Your hands are younger than your father's were, but they look older. Work and cold and poor food have aged them. The fire creates shadows on the wall. For just a moment, you let yourself feel the warmth. You hold your palms toward the flames and close your eyes. In your memory, unbidden, comes the taste of fresh bread. Real bread made with wheat flour, the crust golden and cracking when broken, the inside soft and steaming. Your mouth waters at the memory, and you open your eyes quickly, pushing the thought away. Memory can be cruel. Your spouse stirs behind you. You hear the rustle of straw, the soft grunt of someone waking into discomfort. A moment later, they sit up, blanket pulled around their shoulders.
"Any grain left?" The voice is quiet, rough from sleep and disuse. You nod toward the corner where a small clay pot sits. "Some? Enough for thin soup?" Your spouse nods. No smile, no frown. Just acceptance. This is what days begin with now. An accounting of what little remains, a calculation of how to make it last one more day. Together you prepare the morning meal. The pot contains perhaps 2 handfuls of grain. Barley and oats mixed together, both of poor quality.
Last year's harvest was destroyed by rain. It rained from April through September, a cold, relentless rain that turned the fields into swamps and rotted the grain in its stalks. What little was salvaged had already begun to spoil. Much of it was fed to the animals just to save their lives, And then winter came early, and many of the animals died anyway, unable to survive on the meager fodder that remained. The grain you have now was distributed by the Lord's steward 2 weeks ago in a ration for each household, carefully measured. It was supposed to last a month. You've been rationing the ration, making it stretch. You add water from a wooden bucket by the door. The water was drawn yesterday from the village well. It's cold, of course, and slightly brown. You try not to think about what might be in it. In better times, you might have worried. Now you're simply grateful for any liquid to thin the grain. The pot goes over the fire. You stir it with a wooden spoon, watching the grain slowly soften, the water gradually thickening into something that could generously be called porridge, but is really just wet grain. The smell is not appetizing. It's bland, slightly sour, the scent of survival rather than sustenance. The children wake. You hear them before you see them. The small sounds of movement, whispered words between them. Then they appear at the edge of the firelight, standing close together. Your eldest is 8, a girl with your spouse's eyes and your stubborn chin. Your youngest is the boy, 5 winters old, with knees that seem too large for his thin legs. They don't ask if there's food. They simply wait, standing patiently, their eyes tracking your movements as you stir the pot. There's something in their stillness that makes your chest ache. They've learned not to hope too loudly, not to expect too much. Children shouldn't have to learn such lessons. You divide the thin soup into 4 wooden bowls. The portions are small. The children receive slightly more than the adults. Not much more, but enough to notice. You and your spouse eat slowly, making the warmth and substance last as long as possible. The children eat faster, scraping their bowls with crusts of dark bread that you'd been saving. The bread is hard as wood, made from a mixture of grain and ground acorns and something else you'd rather not identify. But soaked in the warm liquid, it becomes edible. When the meal is finished, there is no satisfaction, only a slight diminishment of the hollowness. The bowls are wiped clean with fingers, then licked. Nothing can be wasted. Outside, the day is beginning. You can tell not by light. The light barely changes, just shifts from black to grey, but by sounds. The creak of a door opening nearby. The low of a cow, thin and mournful. Somewhere, someone coughs, a deep, wet sound that carries through the still air. You dress in your other clothes. The clothes for work, even more worn than your sleeping clothes. Multiple layers, each one thin, patched, barely holding together. The trick is layers. Air trapped between cloth provides insulation. You've learned this. Everyone has learned this. Your spouse wraps cloth around their feet before putting on their shoes. The shoes are wooden clogs with leather uppers, and the leather has cracked. The cloth keeps the cold out mostly. Your children have no shoes. They wrap their feet in rags and try to avoid the worst of the mud and ice. Together you prepare to face the day. The door opens, and the cold enters like an entity, rushing in, claiming space. You step out quickly and close the door behind you, trying to keep what little warmth remains inside. The village is waking slowly, reluctantly. Thatched roofs covered in frost extend in uneven rows down the muddy path that serves as the main street. Smoke rises from a few hearths, thin grey columns that fade into the grey sky. Everything is grey. The sky, the buildings, the ground, even the faces of the people you pass. Colour seems to have leached from the world, as if winter has washed everything in the same cold, lifeless palette. You walk toward the well at the village centre. Others are already there, a small gathering of figures wrapped in layers, moving slowly, conserving energy. You recognize faces, neighbours you've known your entire life, but they've changed. Cheeks hollow, eyes sunken, skin stretched tight over bone. Your neighbour Edmund, who once laughed easily and lifted full grain sacks as if they weighed nothing, now moves like an old man, though he's younger than you. His wife died last month. The baby she was carrying died with her. These things happen more often now. The well rope is frozen. Someone has already broken the ice, but the rope itself is stiff, difficult to grip. You take your turn, lowering the bucket, feeling the weight of it as it fills, then hauling it up, hand over hand. The rope burns your palms even through the cloth you've wrapped around them. The water sloshes in the bucket, and a few drops spill onto your hands. They're so cold they feel hot at first, then just painfully, achingly cold. You fill your smaller bucket and step aside for the next person. No one speaks much. Words seem to require energy that no one can spare. When people do talk, it's in short sentences, pragmatic exchanges of information. The miller's son died. 3 families left for the south. The priest says prayer on Sunday. News delivered flatly, received with nods. Someone mentions that old William was found yesterday, frozen in his cottage. He'd been dead for perhaps 2 days before anyone noticed. His hearth was cold, his small supply of wood unused beside it. They think perhaps he simply decided to stop. Simply lay down and let the cold take him. No one judges this. Everyone understands. You carry your water back home. The children have emerged and are standing in the doorway watching. There is no school, no games, no lessons. There is only the passage of time, the waiting for the next small meal, the effort of staying warm. Your spouse has gone to the fields. There is little to do there, and the ground is frozen solid, no planting possible, but the Lord requires maintenance of the boundaries, clearing of stones, repair of walls, work for the sake of work, keeping order, even when order seems pointless. But refusing the Lord's demands means losing what little protection and rations his household provides. So you go, you work, you endure. You spend your day at various tasks. There is always something that needs mending, your cloak, the children's clothes, the roof thatch. You gather what dead wood you can find, always staying within the permitted boundaries, always aware of the Lord's game warden who patrols the forest borders. Being caught stealing wood means fines you cannot pay, or worse, physical punishment. The stocks, the whip. You've seen it happen. At midday, you share another small meal with the children, more thin soup this time without even the hard bread to accompany it. The children don't complain. They sit quietly, holding their warm bowls in small hands, sipping slowly. In the afternoon, you attempt some work that might bring in a few coins. You have a small skill. You can weave simple baskets from river reeds. But the river is frozen, and the reeds from last autumn are nearly gone. Still, you work with what you have, your fingers moving through familiar patterns, creating something from almost nothing. Perhaps you can trade a basket for a handful of grain. Perhaps. The light begins to fail early, as it always does now. By mid-afternoon, the greyness is deepening toward darkness. You call the children inside, the fire has died again, and you face the same calculation as this morning. Burn wood now, or save it for later. You compromise. A very small fire, just enough to push back the darkness, to create a center of light to gather around. Your spouse returns as night settles fully. They look exhausted, moving slowly, lowering themselves to sit near the fire with visible relief. You don't ask about the day. You can see it in their posture, in their silence. The evening meal is the same as the midday meal. Soup, thin, barely enough, divided carefully. After eating, there is little to do but sit near the small fire and wait for sleep. No one has energy for talk or songs. The children lean against each other, their eyes half closed. Your spouse stares into the flames, thinking private thoughts. You find yourself remembering. Not deliberately, the memories simply arrive, unbidden. You remember harvest festivals from before the rains came, when the autumn brought relief and plenty, when tables were laden with food, when people danced and sang and celebrated the work of a successful year. You remember your wedding day, the small feast your families managed to provide, the feeling of hope that accompanied new beginnings. You remember when your first child was born, the overwhelming love and terror and determination to provide, to protect, to build a good life. All of that seems impossibly distant now, separated not just by years, but by a fundamental change in the world. That was the warm time, the easy time. This is different. This is the test. And yet, even in this cold, even in this hunger, there are moments. Small ones. The warmth of your child's hand slipping into yours. The way your spouse's eyes meet yours in understanding without words needed. The fact that you are still here, still together, still breathing. Survival has become its own form of defiance. Every day you wake, every meal you stretch, every night you keep your family warm enough to see morning. These are victories. Quiet, uncelebrated victories, but victories nonetheless. Outside, the wind picks up. You can hear it moving through the thatched roof, a soft whistling sound that has become the soundtrack of these years. The wind carries no promise of change, but it carries something else. The simple fact that the world continues, that time moves forward even when it seems frozen. Eventually, the fire dies to embers. You bank them carefully, covering them with ash to preserve what heat remains. The family prepares for bed. The same straw mattress, the same damp wool blankets, the same close-packed arrangement of bodies seeking warmth. As you lie in the darkness, waiting for sleep, you think about tomorrow. It will be the same as today, the same cold, the same hunger, the same quiet struggle, and the day after will be the same. And the day after that. How long can this continue? No one knows. The old people say they've never seen anything like it. The priests say it's God's test or God's punishment or God's mysterious plan. But lying here in the dark, you think simpler thoughts. Will my children survive? Will we see spring? Will the earth ever remember how to give life again? You don't have answers. No one does. All you have is the determination to wake again tomorrow, to ration the grain again, to survive one more day. The rhythm of your days has become the rhythm of endurance. Slow, persistent, unheroic. You are not a hero. You are simply a person trying to live through winter. A winter that has forgotten how to end. But sleep comes eventually even to the hungry, even to the cold, and in sleep sometimes there are dreams of warmth. Tomorrow will come, you will wake, you will endure, because what else is there to do? Let us drift now from the frozen cottage to the cold stone halls of power. Let us turn our attention to a young man wearing a crown that weighs more than gold ever could. His name is Edward, second of that name to rule England, and though he sits upon a throne, he too will learn what it means to be helpless before the sky. Edward is born in 1284, the fourth son of King Edward II, that fierce, long-limbed warrior known as Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. The young Edward grows up in the shadow of his father's reputation, in castles that echo with the sounds of preparation for war, in a world where kingship means conquest and strength means everything. But young Edward is not his father. This becomes clear early. He is tall, yes, and physically strong. He enjoys athletics, wrestling, rowing, swimming, activities that would be admirable in anyone but a prince. His father watches with growing concern as his son spends time with common labourers, with grooms and blacksmiths, learning their trades, speaking their language. Edward likes to dig ditches, he likes to thatch roofs. He finds joy in simple, physical work in the company of men who speak plainly and expect nothing from him but his presence. This is not what kings do. His father tries to mold him, to shape him into a proper ruler. But Edward resists in his quiet way, not through rebellion, but through simply being himself. He is more interested in friendship than in governance, more moved by loyalty than by strategy. He falls in love easily, not just with women, though there will be women, but with people, with companions, with anyone who offers him genuine affection in a world of ceremony and distance. When Edward is 16, he meets Piers Gaveston. Gaveston is the son of a Gascon knight, a young man of charm and wit and striking good looks. He is clever with words, skilled at jousting, and he understands something important about the young prince. Edward is lonely, desperately, achingly lonely in his gilded world. Gaveston offers friendship, and Edward accepts it with the wholehearted devotion of someone who has been waiting his entire life for exactly this. They become inseparable. The bond between them is intense, immediate, and, to the eyes of the court, inappropriate. Whether their relationship is romantic, whether it crosses boundaries beyond deep friendship, history cannot say with certainty. What is certain is that Edward loves Gaveston in a way that will shape and ultimately help destroy his reign. Edward's father watches this friendship with growing fury. In 1307, as the old king lies dying in the north, still trying to conquer Scotland, one of his final acts is to exile Gaveston from England. "Keep him away from my son," the old king commands. But his words are wasted breath. Within months of his father's death, Edward II is king, and one of his first royal acts is to recall Gaveston from exile. More than recall him. Edward showers Gaveston with titles, with lands, with the earldom of Cornwall. He gives him jewels that belong to the crown, gifts that should have gone to Edward's own bride, Isabella of France. At Edward's coronation, it is Gaveston who carries the crown, Gaveston who sits in the place of honour, Gaveston who wears clothes more magnificent than the king's own. The nobles watch this with barely concealed contempt. Who is this Gascon upstart? Why does he receive what should belong to those of proper English blood? Why does the king gaze at him with such obvious affection while his young queen sits ignored? The court begins to fracture, factions form. The great lords, men with their own armies, their own power bases, begin to move against Gaveston. They demand his exile. Edward refuses. They demand again, threatening civil war. Reluctantly, Edward sends Gaveston away, but not for long. Within a year, Gaveston is back. Edward cannot bear to be without him. The nobles grow angrier. The cycle repeats. Exile, return, exile, return. Each time with tensions rising higher, with Edward's authority eroding further. In 1312, the situation reaches its breaking point. A group of nobles, led by the Earl of Lancaster, captures Gaveston. They hold a mock trial. They find him guilty of crimes against the realm. And on a grey June morning, on a hillside called Blacklow Hill, they execute him. Some accounts say he was beheaded. Others suggest he was run through with a sword first, then beheaded. The details vary, but the result is the same. Piers Gaveston is dead. When Edward receives the news, something inside him breaks. He withdraws into grief so profound that it alarms even those who despise him. He refuses to eat. He shuts himself in his chambers. When he finally emerges, he is changed, harder, stranger, more distant. He swears vengeance against those who killed his beloved friend, but his swearing sounds hollow. He has learned that being king does not mean having power over the things that matter most. This is the man who will face the Great Famine. In 1314, Edward leads an army north to Scotland, seeking the military glory that has eluded him, trying perhaps to prove himself in the way his father would have approved. At Bannockburn, the Scottish forces under Robert the Bruce destroy the English army. It is a catastrophic defeat, one of the worst in English history. Edward barely escapes with his life, fleeing the battlefield in chaos. He returns to England diminished, his authority shattered, his kingdom unstable. The nobles who hated Gaveston now hate Edward himself. The treasury is depleted, the government is fractured, and then the rains begin. It starts in the spring of 1315. April arrives, but instead of gentle showers, there is deluge. Rain falls in sheets, in walls, in relentless curtains of water that turn roads into rivers and fields into lakes. The planting season, at that crucial window when seeds must go into the ground, passes in waterlogged chaos. Farmers try to plant anyway, wading through mud, but the seeds rot before they can sprout. May brings more rain. June brings more rain. July, August, September. Rain, rain, rain. Cold rain driven by winds that feel like autumn, though it should be summer. The crops that manage to grow stand in water, their roots drowning, their stalks weakening. When harvest time comes, there is almost nothing to harvest. What little grain can be cut is already spoiled, black with mould, useless. The kingdom begins to starve. Edward, in his palaces, receives reports. His councillors bring him numbers, estimates of crop failures, requests for action. He issues decrees, he sets price controls on grain, trying to prevent merchants from profiteering on scarcity. But you cannot decree abundance, you cannot legislate sunshine. The winter of 1315-1316 is brutal, without adequate grain stores, without fodder for livestock, without the buffer that a good harvest provides. The kingdom enters a death spiral. Animals die by the thousands. Horses, cattle, sheep, pigs all perish from starvation or cold or disease that spreads more easily through weakened bodies. Spring the 1316 brings hope that the previous year was an aberration. Surely the weather will return to normal. Surely this cannot continue, but it does continue. The rains return in April 1316, just as severe, just as relentless. Another growing season drowns. Another harvest fails. Now the famine truly begins. In London, bread prices soar to levels unimaginable just 2 years before. A loaf that once cost a penny now costs 12 pence, 16 pence more. And even at those prices, there is often no bread to buy. Bakers close their shops. They have no flour to work with. Markets stand empty. The usual sounds of a city, the calls of vendors, the bustle of commerce, fade into hungry silence. In the countryside, the situation is worse. Village after village empties as people flee, searching for food that doesn't exist anywhere. Some head to the cities hoping for charity. Some head to monasteries and churches begging for sanctuary. Some simply walk until they can walk no more. And then they lie down beside the roads and die. Chronicles from this period, written by monks in monasteries that themselves begin to run short of food, record horrors in careful Latin script. They write of parents abandoning children. They write of children found eating grass, bark, roots of plants that make them sick, but at least fill their stomachs. They write of bodies in ditches, bodies in doorways, bodies everywhere. Some chronicles mention cannibalism, not openly, not stated directly, but hinted at in careful euphemisms. Men did things that are shameful to relate, one monk writes. The living fed upon what should never be consumed. Whether these accounts are accurate or exaggerated, whether they reflect isolated incidents or something more widespread, we cannot know with certainty. But the fact that chroniclers even mention such things suggests how desperately hungry the kingdom has become. Edward tries to respond. He organizes distributions of grain from royal stores, but the royal stores are finite and the need is infinite. He commands the church to provide charity, and the church does what it can, but monasteries that once fed hundreds can now barely feed their own monks. He sends envoys to the continent, trying to arrange imports of grain, but other regions are suffering too, and what grain can be found is prohibitively expensive. In his private chambers, Edward is said to walk alone for hours, speaking to no one. Some servants report hearing him talking to himself, or perhaps praying, though his words are unclear. He has taken another favourite by now, Hugh Despenser the Younger, another handsome, ambitious man who fills the void left by Gaveston. But this relationship brings Edward no peace, only more conflict with nobles who despise Despenser as much as they despised Gaveston. The king's marriage is cold. Queen Isabella, daughter of the King of France, has given Edward 4 children, doing her duty, but there is no warmth between them. She watches her husband lavish attention on his favourites, while she sits in her apartments, increasingly bitter, increasingly aware that she is little more than a political necessity to him. The year 1317 brings slight improvement. The rains ease somewhat, but the damage is done. 2 years of crop failure have decimated livestock populations, depleted seed stocks, destroyed the infrastructure of agriculture. Even with better weather, there is not enough seed to plant, not enough animals to plough, not enough hands to work the fields. Too many workers have died or fled. The recovery is agonizingly slow. Harvests remain poor through 1318, 1319, 1320. Each year slightly better than the last, but nowhere near the abundance that existed before 1315. The kingdom that emerges from the Great Famine is fundamentally changed. It is smaller, weaker, more fearful. Population estimates suggest that England lost somewhere between 10 and 25% of its people during the famine years. Hundreds of thousands dead. Entire villages abandoned, their fields returning to wilderness. The social fabric strained to breaking, with trust between lord and peasant, between king and noble, between neighbour and neighbour, frayed by the desperate struggle for survival. Edward's reign does not recover. The famine has exposed his weakness, his inability to protect his people, even from the weather. The nobles grow bolder in their opposition. His favouritism toward Hugh Despenser drives more and more lords into rebellion. His wife, Queen Isabella, eventually flees to France, taking their son with her. From there, she plots with her lover, Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord, to invade England and overthrow her husband. In 1326, Isabella returns with an army. Edward's support crumbles almost immediately. He flees, trying to reach Wales, but is captured. In January 1327, he is forced to abdicate in favour of his 14-year-old son, who becomes Edward III. The former king is imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. The official story is that he dies there in September 1327 of natural causes, but rumours persist. Rumours of murder, of assassination by red-hot poker inserted in a way that would leave no external marks, of screams heard throughout the castle on the night of his death. Whether these rumours are true or invented by later hostile chroniclers, we cannot know. What we do know is this: Edward II, who loved his friends too much and his kingdom too little, who faced a catastrophe he could not prevent, who watched his realm shrink and starve while he stood helpless, dies in a cold cell, abandoned by nearly everyone. The famine that broke his kingdom did not begin with him, and it did not end with him. It was larger than any one person, larger than any crown. It was the sky itself turning hostile, and before such things even kings are powerless. In the years after Edward's death, the climate slowly stabilizes, harvests gradually improve. Villages are rebuilt, though many remain empty, their populations never restored. Life continues as it always does, but with a new awareness of fragility, a new understanding that the seeming stability of the world can vanish overnight, replaced by cold and hunger and the slow erosion of everything taken for granted. Edward II is buried in Gloucester Cathedral, in a tomb that becomes, ironically, a site of pilgrimage. People come to pray there, to ask for miracles, to light candles. The failed king becomes, in death, something close to a saint, not officially, but in popular memory. Perhaps people sense in his story something tragic and sympathetic. Perhaps they forgive him for his failures, recognizing that some failures are too large for any one person to prevent. Or perhaps they simply remember that he too suffered, that he too endured the long winter, that he too was human beneath the crown. The rain that destroyed his kingdom lasted 7 years. The ripples of its destruction lasted generations. And in the cold stone churches of England, monks continued to write chronicles recording the events for posterity, ending their accounts with phrases like, "And may God preserve us from such times again," and "Let this be a lesson to the proud," and, most simply, most honestly, "We survived." Because in the end, that was the only victory available, survival itself. Let us drift now into an even quieter realm. Let us move forward through time, leaving behind the cold villages and troubled kings, and arrive in our own modern age. Here, in the present day, people with trowels and brushes kneel in the earth, carefully excavating the past. And what they find raises questions that whisper across the centuries. Imagine yourself standing at an archaeological site in northern England. It is early morning, perhaps in summer, and mist still clings to the ground. The site is a former village abandoned centuries ago, its buildings long collapsed into the earth, its fields returned to grass and wildflowers. The only indication that people once lived here is a slight unevenness in the landscape, gentle rises and depressions that trained eyes can read like text. The air is cool and damp. Dew beads on the grass, each droplet catching the pale morning light like tiny prisms. In the distance, perhaps, you can hear sheep bleating or the call of a crow. The sound carries across the empty fields with crystalline clarity, as if the landscape itself is holding its breath. Modern England stretches around this place, roads, power lines, the distant hum of traffic on the motorway. But here, in this field, the present seems to fade. The landscape holds memory in its contours. In the subtle ways the ground rises and falls, marking where walls once stood, where paths once ran, where people once gathered and worked and lived their lives. If you walk slowly across the site, you can feel the history beneath your feet. The grass grows differently where buildings once stood, slightly shorter, slightly different in color, responding to the altered chemistry of soil that once supported stone foundations. The depressions mark where wells were dug, where ditches drained water from the village lanes, where centuries of footsteps wore the earth into permanent grooves. The archaeologists have been working here for weeks. They have uncovered foundation stones, fragments of pottery, the remains of a small church. Each day brings new discoveries. A bone comb, a corroded knife blade, pieces of leather that might have been shoes, the carbonized remains of grain that tells them what crops were grown here. And then, in the area that would have been the village cemetery, they find something that makes them pause. A mass grave, not organized, not carefully arranged, but hastily dug and hastily filled. Bodies piled together, adults and children, men and women, young and old, all mixed in what appears to have been desperate haste. The bones lie tangled, some in positions that suggest they were simply dropped rather than laid to rest. There are no coffins, no shrouds that survived, no markers to indicate who these people were. Just bones, compressed together by centuries of earth, pressing down, leaching the calcium, staining everything the color of the surrounding clay. The discovery comes on a Thursday afternoon. One of the excavators, a graduate student working carefully with a trowel, uncovers what appears to be a single skeleton. But as more soil is removed, another skeleton appears beside it, and then another. The careful brushing away of centuries of accumulated earth reveals not a few burials, but dozens, layer upon layer of human remains, compressed together in a pit perhaps 4 meters across and 2 meters deep. The team leader is called over. Photographs are taken from multiple angles. The grid coordinates are double-checked, triple-checked. Everyone becomes very quiet, very careful. This is not a normal cemetery. This is something else entirely. Something that speaks of crisis, of catastrophe, of a community overwhelmed. The usual chatter of the excavation site dies away. People work in near silence, each aware they are uncovering something significant, something that deserves reverence. The archaeologists carefully expose the remains, documenting everything, taking photographs, making notes. They use the smallest brushes for the most delicate work, removing soil grain by grain from around fragile bones. They collect samples for radiocarbon dating, carefully labeling each one, noting its exact position in the grave. And when the results return, they confirm what the excavators suspected. These people died in the early 14th century, right in the window of the Great Famine. Somewhere between 1315 and 1322, this entire group was buried together in a single pit. But why? And who buried them? These are the questions that haunt the researchers as they work. Mass graves usually suggest catastrophic events, plague, warfare, sudden disaster. But the Great Famine was not sudden. It unfolded over years. Why would an entire group die at once? Or did they die separately and get buried together simply because there was no strength left to dig individual graves? Perhaps the ground was frozen when the deaths occurred, making individual burial impossible. Perhaps disease struck quickly after years of malnutrition had weakened everyone's immune systems. Perhaps the survivors were simply too few and too weak to manage anything more than this single communal pit. The bones themselves offer some answers, but raise even more questions. When the skeletal remains are analyzed in laboratories, forensic anthropologists begin to read the stories written in calcium and marrow. Many of the skeletons show clear signs of malnutrition. Bones that stopped growing during childhood, leaving permanent lines of arrested development. Teeth that formed improperly, with pits and grooves indicating periods of severe stress. Bones that are thinner than they should be, more porous, weakened by lack of proper nutrients over extended periods. These markers are called Harris lines, horizontal lines of increased bone density that form when growth is interrupted by illness or starvation and then resumes. Under microscopy, they appear as clear bands across the bone, permanent records of crisis survived, at least temporarily. Some of the famine skeletons show multiple Harris lines, suggesting that these individuals had experienced repeated periods of severe deprivation throughout their lives. It's possible to count them like rings in a tree and estimate when in a person's life each crisis occurred. The teeth tell their own stories. Dental enamel forms in stages during childhood, and any disruption to nutrition or health during those critical periods leaves permanent defects. The technical term is enamel hyperplasia, areas where the enamel is thinner or has pits and grooves. By examining these defects, researchers can determine not just that someone experienced malnutrition, but approximately when in their childhood it occurred. Many of the famine victims show enamel hyperplasia from their earliest years, suggesting they were born into hardship and never knew plenty. But interestingly, not all the skeletons show these signs. Some appear relatively healthy at the time of death. Their bones are of normal density, their teeth reasonably sound. These individuals were not suffering from long-term malnutrition. So how did they end up in the same mass grave as those who clearly starved? What killed them, if not slow starvation? One possibility is disease. Malnutrition weakens the immune system, making populations vulnerable to infections that might otherwise be survived. Perhaps an epidemic swept through the village. Typhus, dysentery, or some other illness that spreads easily in conditions of poor sanitation and crowding. Such an outbreak could kill quickly, indiscriminately, taking both the already weakened and the relatively healthy within days or weeks of each other. Typhus, in particular, thrives in conditions of poverty and overcrowding. Spread by body lice, it would have found ideal conditions in famine-era villages where people huddled together for warmth, wore the same unwashed clothing for months, and had no resources for basic hygiene. The disease causes high fever, delirium, and a characteristic rash. In populations already weakened by hunger, the mortality rate could exceed 50%. Death typically comes within 2 weeks of infection, as the bacteria attack the lining of blood vessels, causing internal bleeding and organ failure. Dysentery, another likely candidate, spreads through contaminated water, again something that would have been common during the famine. When grain stores run low and people begin eating whatever they can find, including plants and roots washed in polluted water, intestinal diseases flourish. The resulting diarrhea and dehydration can kill within days, especially in young children and the elderly. For people already weakened by malnutrition, even a relatively mild case of dysentery could prove fatal. Another possibility is more subtle and more disturbing. Some of the skeletal remains show evidence of what bioarchaeologists call stress markers, not from long-term malnutrition, but from acute poisoning. The patterns of bone deterioration, the specific ways in which certain teeth and jaw bones have degraded, suggest exposure to toxic substances. And this leads researchers to one of the more haunting aspects of the Great Famine: ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in wet, cold conditions. Exactly the conditions that prevailed during the famine years. When grain infected with ergot is ground into flour and consumed, the toxins it contains can cause a condition called ergotism, known in medieval times as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms of ergotism are horrifying. The toxins constrict blood vessels, cutting off circulation to the extremities. Fingers and toes go numb, then painful, then gangrenous. They turn black and eventually fall off. Victims experience burning sensations in their limbs, hence the name fire. But ergot toxins also affect the brain, causing hallucinations, convulsions, psychotic episodes. People suffering from ergotism might see demons, hear voices, believe themselves possessed or cursed. The hallucinations are vivid and terrifying. Historical accounts from later ergot outbreaks describe victims screaming about demons tearing at their flesh, about snakes crawling under their skin, about the walls melting and reforming into nightmarish shapes. They report feeling as though they are burning alive from the inside, as though their blood has turned to fire in their veins. Some become catatonic, staring at visions no one else can see. Others become violent, attacking people they claim are demons in disguise. Now imagine a village during the famine. Food is desperately scarce. When grain is finally available, even if it's moldy, even if it's partially rotted, even if it has strange, dark growths clinging to the kernels, people eat it because the alternative is starvation. They grind the infected grain into flour, bake it into bread, and consume it because there is nothing else. Perhaps they notice the bread tastes bitter or has an unusual smell. Perhaps they feel their mouths tingle strangely after eating it. But hunger overrides caution. And then the hallucinations begin, the convulsions, the burning pain. In a population already traumatized by years of hunger, already living in fear and deprivation, the symptoms of ergot poisoning must have seemed like supernatural punishment. Perhaps they thought God was cursing them. Perhaps they blamed witchcraft or demons or their own sins. Imagine being a medieval villager with no knowledge of fungal toxins, no understanding of biological contamination. Your neighbor begins screaming about demons. Her hands turn black. She tears at her own flesh, trying to stop the burning. Another man falls into convulsions, speaking in tongues, claiming angels and devils are fighting over his soul. A child goes still and vacant-eyed, staring at things no one else can see. What would you think? How would you understand it? The most logical explanation within the medieval worldview would be demonic possession, divine punishment, or witchcraft. And so, in addition to the physical suffering of the famine, communities had to grapple with what they perceived as spiritual warfare, as supernatural judgment upon their sins. Soil samples taken from the mass grave sites showed traces of ergot alkaloids, the chemical signatures of the fungus, still present in the earth after 700 years. The grain that killed these people has long since vanished, but its poison remains a whisper in the dirt. These alkaloids, ergotamine, ergocristine, and others, are remarkably stable compounds. Even after centuries of exposure to moisture, bacteria, and changing soil chemistry, sophisticated mass spectrometry can detect their presence. The concentrations found in the famine burial sites are significantly higher than in control samples from the same locations but different time periods. This strongly suggests that ergot-contaminated grain was present at the time of burial, possibly even consumed shortly before death. At other sites across northern Europe, archaeologists find similar patterns in Yorkshire, in East Anglia, in parts of Scotland and Ireland and northern France. Wherever the rains were worst, wherever the famine bit deepest, they find these hasty burials, these tangled graves. The pattern is consistent enough that researchers can now map the severity of the famine by the density of mass burial sites. At a site near York, excavators discover something particularly poignant. In a mass grave containing perhaps 30 individuals, they find a woman buried with an infant cradled in her arms. The position is deliberate, careful. Even in the rush to dispose of so many bodies, someone took time to place that baby in its mother's embrace. The woman's skeleton shows signs of long-term malnutrition. The infant's bones are so small, so fragile, that determining cause of death is impossible. But together they lie 7 centuries later, still holding each other. The woman's age at death is estimated at somewhere between 25 and 35. Young by modern standards, but not unusual for the medieval period. Her pelvis shows scarring consistent with having given birth multiple times. Perhaps this infant was her last child, born into famine, nursed by a mother who had nothing to give. Perhaps they died together, the mother's body finally giving out, unable to sustain both herself and the child. Or perhaps the child died first, and the mother soon after, from grief or exhaustion, or simply the culmination of years of deprivation. Near their bodies, the archaeologists find a small lead cross, the kind that common people wore as protection, and wrapped in what remains of cloth, they find seeds, just a few grain seeds carefully preserved, as if someone buried them as an offering or a prayer, or perhaps a hope that even in death, the symbol of future harvests might bring comfort. The seeds are wheat, not the hardy primitive varieties of earlier centuries, but a cultivated strain that would have been relatively precious. Someone chose to bury these seeds rather than plant them or eat them. In a time when every grain mattered, when people were literally starving, this represents an enormous sacrifice. It speaks to the depth of love or respect that the living felt for the dead, and to the persistence of hope even in the most hopeless circumstances. This discovery raises another question. What were the burial practices during the famine? How did communities handle death when death became so common? From surviving church records, those that weren't destroyed or lost, we know that proper Christian burial became increasingly difficult. The church taught that bodies should be blessed, prayers said, the dead laid to rest in consecrated ground with the expectation of resurrection. But when dozens of people are dying, when the priest himself may be weak from hunger, when the frozen ground makes digging nearly impossible, how do you maintain such practices? Some records mention the suspending of usual burial fees. the church recognizing that families had no money to pay for proper funerals. Other records show priests traveling between multiple parishes, trying to keep up with the dead, blessing mass graves rather than individual interments. One chronicle from Yorkshire mentions a priest who blessed 7 mass graves in a single week, moving from village to village, performing abbreviated services for the dozens of bodies in each pit. Another record notes that burial fees were waived for all who died between harvest seasons of 1316 and 1318, an acknowledgement that normal practices had become impossible. There are accounts of priests dying while performing burial services, collapsing from exhaustion or illness while standing over open graves. Some villages went months without a priest because the previous one had died, and no replacement could be found willing to risk traveling through famine-stricken regions. In these cases, burials would have been performed by lay people, if they were performed at all, with whatever remembered prayers and rituals people could manage. The absence of priests created a theological crisis alongside the physical one. Without proper burial rites, could souls reach heaven? Without the blessing of consecrated ground, were the dead condemned to wander as restless spirits? These questions must have tormented the survivors, who had no choice but to bury their loved ones without proper ceremony. But there's also evidence of improvisation, of folk practices reasserting themselves alongside official church ritual. At several sites, archaeologists find burials that include pre-Christian elements, stones placed in specific patterns, herbs that have long since decayed but left chemical traces in the soil, positioning of bodies that doesn't align with standard Christian burial orientation. In one grave in East Anglia, a skeleton was found face down, deliberately placed that way, the archaeologists conclude, because the position is too consistent to be accidental. Face-down burial was sometimes used for suspected criminals, suicides, or those believed to be possessed by evil spirits. Had this person done something during the famine that led their community to bury them this way? Or was it believed they died of causes that required this precaution? The skeleton itself offers no answers, just bones, silent, keeping their secrets. The face-down burial is particularly intriguing because it suggests a level of deliberation and decision-making even in crisis. Someone, the community, a family member, a local authority, decided this person should not be buried in the normal Christian manner. This wasn't simply a matter of haste or convenience. It was a statement, a judgment, a ritual performed with specific intent. What that intent was, we can only speculate. Perhaps this person was blamed for the community's misfortune. Perhaps they were suspected of witchcraft, of causing the endless rains and failed harvests through malicious magic. Perhaps the most unsettling discoveries come from abandoned villages, settlements that simply ceased to exist after the famine years. When archaeologists excavate these sites, they sometimes find that the last inhabitants didn't bury their dead at all. They simply left them. At Warham Percy in Yorkshire, a village that was abandoned in stages over several centuries, excavators found human remains in one of the houses, not in a grave, but lying on what would have been the floor, mixed with collapsed roof timbers and decayed household goods. The bones show signs of having been scavenged by animals, which means they lay exposed for some time before the house finally collapsed and covered them. The implication is grim. The last residents of that house either died with no one left to bury them, or the survivors were too weak, too few, or too desperate to escape to deal with the dead. They simply left, fleeing towards some hoped-for refuge, and left their dead behind. Warham Percy is not unique. Across northern England and southern Scotland there are dozens of abandoned medieval villages, their locations now marked only by subtle earthworks and the occasional foundation stone. Many of these settlements show evidence of gradual depopulation over decades or even centuries, but some show signs of more abrupt abandonment. and in several of these, human remains have been found in contexts that suggest they were left unburied. At one site in Northumberland, excavators found 3 skeletons in what had been a barn or outbuilding. The position of the bones and the surrounding artifacts suggest these people took shelter in the building during winter and never left. Perhaps they were refugees from an even harder hit area, seeking shelter and finding only a different kind of death. Perhaps they were the last inhabitants of this particular village, too weak to continue their flight. The teeth of these individuals show signs of having consumed unusual substances in their final days. High levels of silica suggesting they ate clay or ground stone, chemical markers indicating consumption of tree bark and lichen. These are the foods of absolute desperation, of people who have exhausted every other option and are simply trying to put anything into their stomachs to ease the grinding pain of starvation. Clay consumption in particular leaves distinctive traces. The silica particles become embedded in dental enamel and bone tissue, creating a characteristic pattern that forensic anthropologists can identify. People eat clay because it creates a feeling of fullness, temporarily easing hunger pangs, even though it provides no nutrition whatsoever. It can also cause severe constipation and intestinal blockages, adding to the suffering of those already weakened by starvation. These archaeological findings paint a picture that written records often obscure. Chronicles tell us numbers, percentages of crop failure, estimates of mortality, but they rarely convey the human reality of those numbers. The bones do that. The hasty graves, the abandoned bodies, the desperate little offerings buried alongside the dead, these speak more eloquently than any chronicle. Modern forensic techniques allow researchers to extract even more information. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can reveal diet patterns, showing what people ate during different periods of their lives. The results from famine-era skeletons show predictable shifts. Less meat protein, more plant materials, and, toward the end, signs of consuming substances that shouldn't be food at all. Isotope analysis works by examining the ratios of different isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in bone collagen. These ratios reflect the types of foods consumed during the years when that particular bone tissue was forming. By analyzing different bones or different layers within the same bone, researchers can track dietary changes over time with remarkable precision. In famine-era skeletons, the isotope signatures show a clear progression. In the years before the famine, the ratios indicate a diet that included regular, if modest, amounts of animal protein, meat, eggs, dairy products. As the famine progresses, these signatures shift toward a diet composed almost entirely of plant materials. And in the final stages, the signatures become erratic and difficult to interpret, suggesting consumption of materials that don't fit normal dietary categories. Some skeletons show high levels of heavy metals, lead, mercury, absorbed from eating contaminated water plants or from consuming grain stored in lead-lined containers. Others show chemical markers suggesting the consumption of clay or chalk, substances people ate to fill their stomachs when nothing else was available. The lead levels in particular are striking. Medieval grain storage sometimes involved lead-lined containers or lead-based preservatives, and during the famine, people would have consumed grain that had been stored for years, allowing more time for lead to leach into the food. Additionally, as people became desperate, they turned to any plant material they could find, including aquatic plants from polluted streams and marshes. These plants can accumulate heavy metals from the surrounding environment, and consuming them in large quantities can lead to toxic accumulation in bone tissue. There's also evidence, in some remains, of what anthropologists delicately call resource stress indicators, patterns of trauma and bone damage consistent with violence. Not warfare, not organized conflict, but the kind of violence that erupts in desperate times. Defensive wounds on forearms, blunt force trauma to skulls, bones that healed poorly, or not at all, before death. One skeleton from a site in Lincolnshire shows a healed fracture to the ulna, the forearm bone, of a type typically seen in defensive injuries when someone raises their arm to ward off a blow. The fracture healed, but poorly, leaving the bone misaligned. This person survived at least one violent encounter during the famine years, but their arm would have remained weak and painful for the rest of their life, which, given that they ended up in a famine mass grave, was probably not very long. Another skeleton, this one from Scotland, shows multiple healed rib fractures on the left side of the body. The pattern is consistent with repeated blunt force trauma, not a single violent incident but ongoing abuse or assault. Whether this violence was related to the famine or predated it is impossible to determine, but it speaks to a life of hardship beyond even the suffering imposed by hunger. The Great Famine was not just a time of passive suffering, it was also a time when social order frayed, when neighbors who had lived peacefully for generations might turn on each other over a handful of grain, when desperation made people capable of things they would never have imagined in easier times. Court records from the period show increases in theft, assault, and murder. People were hanged for stealing bread. Families fractured under the strain, with stronger members abandoning weaker ones to improve their own chances of survival. And yet, alongside these grim discoveries, archaeologists also find evidence of continued care, of humanity persisting even in inhuman conditions. Burials, even hasty ones, represent effort. Someone had to dig the pit, move the bodies, cover them. The placement of that infant in its mother's arms represents love. The seeds and crosses represent hope, or at least the desire to maintain ritual, to assert that life has meaning even when surrounded by death. At one site, researchers found a mass grave where the bodies had been carefully arranged in layers with wooden boards placed between the layers. Someone, despite exhaustion, despite fear, despite the overwhelming nature of the task, took time to organize the burial, to maintain some degree of order and dignity even in catastrophe. The wooden boards, now decayed but leaving clear impressions in the soil, appear to have been taken from buildings, perhaps from houses that were being dismantled because their occupants had died or fled. Their reuse as dividers in the mass grave shows practical thinking, yes, but also a desire to separate the layers, to give each group of dead their own space, however minimal. It's a small gesture, perhaps, but in context, it represents a tremendous act of care and respect.
Who were these people who buried the dead? Were they family members, neighbors, strangers who happened to be passing through and felt obligated to help? We cannot know. Their names are lost, but their actions remain, readable in the arrangement of bones and soil.
Perhaps they were the stronger members of the community, those who had not yet succumbed to illness or starvation. Perhaps they were people from neighboring villages who came to help when word reached them of the deaths. Perhaps they were travelers, merchants, pilgrims, wandering laborers, who felt a moral obligation to ensure the dead were properly covered, even if full burial rites were impossible. What we do know is that they worked hard. Digging pits in medieval England, even in summer, would have been exhausting labor. The soil is heavy clay in many regions, difficult to excavate even with modern tools. With medieval implements, wooden spades, perhaps iron-tipped or simply stakes and bare hands, it would have been back-breaking work. And this was work performed by people who were themselves undernourished, living in a time of crisis, possibly grieving their own losses. As you lie there, drifting towards sleep, imagine those archaeologists at their sites. It's quiet work, archaeology, slow, patient, hours spent on hands and knees, brushing dirt away grain by grain, revealing what has been hidden. The sun moves across the sky, clouds pass, birds sing, and slowly, carefully, the past emerges. The tools of archaeology have changed dramatically over the past century. Where once excavation meant picks and shovels and a basic notebook, now it involves laser scanning, ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, isotope chemistry, and sophisticated computer modeling. But the fundamental nature of the work remains the same. Careful, methodical, reverent attention to what the earth contains. Each bone, each fragment, each trace left in the soil is a word in a story that the dead are still telling. Not a loud story, not a dramatic one. Just the simple truth of their existence. We lived, we struggled, we died, we were buried by those who came after. The excavations continue today. There are undoubtedly more famine graves yet to be discovered, more villages yet to be properly excavated, more bones waiting to tell their stories. Each summer, new teams arrive at new sites, armed with new technologies, new questions, new ways of reading the evidence. Modern archaeology has become increasingly sophisticated in its ability to extract information from skeletal remains. Ancient DNA analysis can now reveal not just the sex and ancestry of individuals, but information about diseases they carried, their genetic predispositions, even sometimes their eye and hair color. Imagine the possibilities, being able to look at a skull from a famine grave and know that this person had blue eyes or red hair, or carried a genetic marker for lactose tolerance. Some research teams are now using strontium isotope analysis to track movement patterns. Different geological regions have different strontium signatures in their soil and water, and these signatures become incorporated into teeth as they form in childhood. By comparing the strontium in a person's teeth to the strontium in their bones, which remodel throughout life, researchers can sometimes determine whether someone died in the region where they were born or whether they migrated during their lifetime. This could help answer questions about whether famine victims were local residents or refugees from elsewhere. The preliminary results of this research are fascinating. Some famine burial sites show that a significant proportion of the deceased were not local. They came from other regions, perhaps fleeing areas where the famine was even worse, perhaps seeking help from relatives in less affected areas, perhaps simply wandering in desperate search of food. These people died far from home, among strangers, and were buried in places they had never known. And sometimes in the evening, when the work is done and the site has been covered for the night, researchers say they feel something. Not quite haunted, but not quite alone either. As if the ground itself remembers. As if 700 years is not really such a long time. As if the boundary between those who dig and those who are buried is thinner than we like to imagine. One archaeologist interviewed about her work on famine sites described standing alone at an excavation at dusk after the rest of the team had left for the day. The mass grave lay open before her, carefully gridded and documented, waiting for the next day's work. A light rain began to fall, the same endless rain that had caused the famine 7 centuries before. And in that moment, she said, she felt an overwhelming connection to the people whose bones she was studying, a sense that their suffering and her concern for them was somehow bridging the gap of centuries. It's not uncommon, apparently. Many archaeologists who work with human remains report similar experiences, not supernatural encounters exactly, but moments of profound emotional connection, of feeling the weight of the past pressing against the present. Perhaps it's simply empathy, the human capacity to imagine ourselves in another's place, or perhaps the dead do speak to us in their way, reminding us that they were once as alive as we are now. The Great Famine left no monuments, no great cathedrals were built to commemorate it, no statues honor its victims. The dead were too numerous, too common, too poor to merit such remembrance. They simply vanished into unmarked graves, into abandoned villages, into the vast silence of forgotten history. This is one of the striking differences between the Great Famine and other historical catastrophes. The Black Death, which struck England 30 years later, was memorialized in art, literature, and architecture. The 100 Years' War produced endless chronicles, heroic tales, monuments to famous battles. But the famine killed more slowly, more quietly, and its victims were largely peasants, people whose lives were already considered unremarkable by those who wrote the histories. There are no famine ballads, no epic poems commemorating the suffering of those years, no paintings depicting the mass graves, no sculptures honoring those who buried the dead. The written records we have are mostly administrative, crop yields, tax revenues, mortality estimates. The human stories behind those numbers were never recorded, never considered worthy of remembrance. But the earth remembers. And now, slowly, carefully, we are learning to read what the earth has preserved. In the quiet hours of the night, when you lie in comfort and safety, it is worth thinking about those bones beneath the frost. Not to disturb your rest, but to gently remind yourself of something important. That humans have always endured, always struggled, always found ways to survive even the longest winters. That love and care persist even in the darkest times. That the simple act of burial, of covering the dead with earth, of marking their passing with whatever small rituals we can manage, is one of the oldest and most human things we do. The capacity for compassion, for maintaining ritual and meaning in the face of horror, is perhaps one of the most defining characteristics of our species. Even in the worst of times, and the Great Famine was surely among the worst, people continued to care for their dead, to honor them in whatever ways remained possible. The mother and infant buried in each other's arms, the seeds placed as offerings, the careful layering of bodies with wooden boards. These are not the actions of a society that has completely broken down, but of one that is fighting desperately to maintain its humanity against overwhelming odds. The archaeologists will return tomorrow. They will continue their patient work, and the bones will continue to speak in their silent way, telling stories of a winter that tried to erase a kingdom, but failed to erase the memory of those who lived through it. Each excavation season brings new discoveries. Last summer, a team working in East Anglia uncovered a small cemetery that had been used exclusively during the famine years. The radiocarbon dates cluster tightly between 1316 and 1320, suggesting this was emergency burial ground created specifically to handle the crisis. The burials are more organized than in many famine graves, suggesting that in this particular community, at least for a time, there were enough surviving residents to maintain some semblance of normal burial practices. This summer, another team plans to excavate a site in Scotland where preliminary ground-penetrating radar has revealed what appears to be a very large mass grave, potentially containing more than 100 individuals. If confirmed, it would be one of the largest famine burial sites yet discovered in Britain. The team is preparing carefully, assembling specialists in forensic anthropology, isotope analysis, ancient DNA, and medieval history. When they open that grave, they will be opening a window into one of the darkest moments in Scottish history. Let that thought carry you now into your own dreams. You are warm, you are safe. You are separated from those hard times by centuries of slow progress, of gradually improving conditions, of knowledge accumulated and shared. Think about what separates your experience from theirs. You likely have never gone a day without food, never wondered whether you would survive the winter, never watched helplessly as those around you starved. You have access to medical care, to clean water, to a global food system that, for all its flaws, generally keeps people fed. You live in a world where crop failure in one region can be compensated by imports from another, where weather patterns are monitored and predicted, where emergency aid can be mobilized when disaster strikes. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because generations of people worked to make it so. Developing better agricultural techniques, building transportation infrastructure, establishing systems of trade and mutual aid, creating institutions to respond to crisis. The suffering of the Great Famine was not inevitable. It was the result of specific historical circumstances, of technological limitations and social structures that left people vulnerable to forces beyond their control. And if, in your dreams, you see misty fields and gentle excavations, If you imagine yourself holding ancient bones with reverent care, if you feel the weight of the past resting lightly in your hands, well, that's just history doing what it does best, reminding us who we were, who we are, and how far we've come. The bones are waiting. In fields and beneath parking lots, under medieval churches and modern housing developments, they lie silent, patient, holding their stories. Some have already been found and studied and reburied with ceremony. Others remain undiscovered, waiting for the day when someone with a trowel and a question will carefully brush away the soil and bring them back into the light. Each one represents a life lived and lost. Each one is a person who once woke in the morning and wondered what the day would bring, who loved and feared and hoped and struggled, who existed in a specific moment of time and then was gone. They are not just data points in a historical analysis, not just evidence of demographic collapse and agricultural crisis. They are human beings and they deserve to be remembered. So as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for them. The nameless dead of the Great Famine, lying in their mass graves, their faces long since returned to dust, their stories forgotten by everyone except the earth itself and the patient archaeologists who seek to read what the earth contains. They were real. They suffered, they died, and now, 7 centuries later, we are beginning to hear their voices again, speaking to us through bone and soil, telling us what it meant to live through the longest winter. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world they helped make possible, a world built on the accumulated lessons of all the disasters that came before. Sleep well, but remember them. Remember that history is not just the stories of kings and battles, but also the quiet testimony of ordinary people who lived and died in extraordinary times. The earth remembers, and so should we. Let us drift now from excavated graves to gilded halls. Let us leave the bones behind and step into the world of those who wore silk even as the kingdom froze. For the Great Famine did not discriminate by class. It touched everyone, but it touched them differently, and in those differences we find uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the fragile nature of both. Imagine yourself standing in the great hall of a manor house in the year 1316. The room is vast, with a high timber ceiling and stone walls hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and biblical stories. At one end, a massive hearth burns with logs the size of young trees, filling the space with wavering light and blessed warmth. The floor is covered with fresh rushes mixed with herbs, lavender, mint, rosemary, their scent rising as people walk across them. You are dressed in fine wool, perhaps even velvet, dyed in colors that peasants will never wear. Deep blues, rich reds, forest greens. Your hands are clean, your face washed with scented water. Around your neck hangs a chain of silver, and on your finger a ring set with a small gemstone that catches the firelight. You are not the lord of this manor, but you are of his household. A minor noble, perhaps, or a wealthy merchant who has purchased favor, or a church official of some standing. You have been invited to dine, and so you sit at one of the long tables arranged in the hall, waiting for the meal to begin. The servants move through the space with practiced efficiency. They wear livery, matching tunics that mark them as belonging to this household. Some carry flagons of wine, others arrange platters on the high table, where the lord and lady will sit. Musicians tune their instruments in a corner, preparing to play during the feast. And yet, despite the warmth and the preparation and the appearance of plenty, there is something different tonight. Something you can sense even before the food arrives, an undercurrent of tension, a brittleness in the atmosphere. The servants move a bit too quickly, speak a bit too quietly. The lord, when he enters with his lady, smiles, but the smile doesn't quite reach his eyes. You know why, of course. Everyone knows. Outside the manor walls, people are starving. The harvest failed again this year. The fields that should be golden with grain are brown with rot. The villagers who work this Lord's land, who owe him labor and loyalty in exchange for his protection, are hollow-eyed and desperate. Some have already fled, abandoning their holdings to search for food elsewhere. Others have died, their cottages standing empty, their debts unpaid. But here, in this hall, the feast goes on. Because it must. Because maintaining the appearance of normalcy, of order, of continuing prosperity, is itself a kind of power. To admit weakness, to acknowledge that even the nobility is threatened by the famine, would be to crack the foundation upon which the entire social structure rests. The meal begins. Servants bring the first course, a thick pottage made with imported spices, the kind that cost more than a labourer earns in a month. You taste cinnamon, cloves, perhaps saffron. The pottage contains meat, though less than you might have expected. Even the nobility's supplies are running low, though no one will say this directly. Between courses, the musicians play. The music is skilled, pleasant, designed to create an atmosphere of celebration. But tonight, even the songs feel forced, like trying to whistle in a graveyard. Someone requests a lively dance tune, and the musicians oblige, but when the music ends, the silence that follows feels heavier than it should. The second course arrives. Roasted fowl, perhaps capon or duck, presented on silver platters with great ceremony. The birds are smaller than they should be, the meat leaner. Livestock is dying throughout the kingdom, even here in the relative plenty of a noble estate. The Lord's gamekeeper has reported that even the wild animals are vanishing. Deer found dead in the forest, rabbits so thin they're hardly worth hunting, birds that no longer return in their usual numbers. But the feast continues. Bread is brought, real wheat bread, white and soft, the kind that common people have not seen in 2 years. You break off a piece, feeling its warmth, breathing in its yeast-rich smell. The guilt that flickers through you is brief, easily suppressed. You did not create this situation. You are not responsible for the weather, for the failed harvests, for the grinding poverty beyond these walls. You are simply fortunate enough to be here rather than out there, aren't you? The Lord rises to speak. He thanks God for the blessings of the table, for the loyalty of his household, for the continuation of proper order, even in difficult times. His words are carefully chosen, acknowledging hardship without dwelling on it, affirming faith without admitting fear. Everyone applauds politely. The lady smiles. The servants pour more wine. But you notice things. You notice that the wine is more watered than usual. You notice that the third course, which in better years would have been an elaborate display of multiple meat dishes, consists of just one platter of salted fish, carefully portioned. You notice that the dessert course, when it finally arrives, is a simple apple tart, rather than the usual array of sweetmeats and candied fruits. These are small economies, barely noticeable to those who've never known want. But to someone accustomed to the abundance of noble tables, they are glaring signs of scarcity creeping even into protected spaces. After the meal, you move to a smaller chamber where the Lord's family and favoured guests gather around another, smaller fire. The conversation turns, inevitably, to the situation outside. Someone mentions that 3 villages on the Lord's lands have been abandoned. Another speaks of increased banditry on the roads, desperate men turning to robbery, the normal mechanisms of law and order breaking down. A church official describes the crowds that gather daily at monastery gates, begging for food that the monasteries can no longer provide. The lady of the manor, a woman who in normal times concerns herself with embroidery and household management, speaks up. She has been distributing food to the poor, she says. Every Sunday after Mass, her servants hand out bread and thin soup to those who come. But the crowds grow larger each week, and her stores grow smaller. She doesn't know how much longer she can continue. The Lord looks uncomfortable. He mutters something about Christian charity, about obligations to one's people, but you can see the calculation in his eyes. Every handful of grain given away is a handful his own household won't have if the famine continues. Every act of generosity depletes reserves that may be desperately needed later. One of the guests, a merchant who trades in wool and cloth, offers a different perspective. The famine, he suggests, may present opportunities. Land that desperate peasants abandon can be claimed. Labour, when it becomes available again, will be cheaper than ever. Workers will accept any terms just to eat. The shortage of goods means those who have supplies can command extraordinary prices. The room grows quiet. No one quite endorses this view, but no one quite condemns it either. It is simply another way of understanding the situation, another strategy for survival. In times like these, sentimentality is a luxury few can afford. Later, you walk the corridors of the manor, heading toward your sleeping quarters. Through a narrow window, you glimpse the night outside. It is snowing, soft, silent, beautiful. The flakes drift down through darkness, settling on the courtyard, on the walls, on the roofs of the outbuildings where the servants sleep. And beyond the manor walls, that same snow falls on the village. On empty cottages and frozen fields, on people huddled in inadequate shelters, burning their furniture for warmth, chewing on leather boiled soft, waiting for a spring that feels impossibly distant. You are warm, you are fed. You are safe behind stone walls with armed guards. But the snow falls on everyone, and somewhere in your heart, you know that the distance between this hall and those cottages is not as great as you'd like to believe. Fortune is fickle. Circumstances change. Today's lord can be tomorrow's beggar if the winds shift enough. But these are uncomfortable thoughts, and you push them away as you settle into your bed. A real bed with a mattress stuffed with wool and feathers, with linen sheets and fur blankets. You say your prayers, asking God to have mercy on the suffering, to end the famine, to restore proper order to the world. And then you sleep. While outside, others lie awake, too cold and too hungry for rest. The church, too, exists in this strange space between abundance and scarcity. Let us drift now to a monastery, one of the great religious houses that dot the landscape of medieval Europe. These are places of prayer and contemplation, yes, but also centers of learning, hospitality, and agricultural production. They own vast lands, collect tithes from surrounding parishes, maintain libraries and scriptoriums where monks copy manuscripts by hand. In normal times, monasteries are oases of stability. They feed travelers, shelter the poor, provide medical care, maintain schools. The monks follow a rule of life that includes regular meals, adequate clothing, comfortable, if not luxurious, living conditions. Their calling requires them to focus on spiritual rather than worldly concerns, and this requires a certain minimum of physical security. But these are not normal times. Imagine yourself now as a monk in such a place. You rise before dawn for the first prayers of the day. Matins, sung in the cold darkness of the chapel. Your breath mists in the air despite the thick walls and the small charcoal braziers placed at intervals. The chapel, like everything else, is colder than it should be. Fuel is scarce. The monastery's vast woodlands are being harvested faster than they can regenerate, and even with their resources, the monks cannot quite keep the cold at bay. After prayers, you return to your cell for a brief rest before the next office. Your cell is small but not uncomfortable, a narrow bed, a small desk, a shelf for books, a window that lets in light. In better times, this simplicity felt virtuous, a rejection of worldly excess. Now it simply feels cold. The day progresses through its rhythm of prayer and work. The divine office structures everything: lords, prime, terse, sext, nun, vespers, compline. 8 times a day the bell calls you to chapel, and 8 times you gather with your brothers to sing the ancient psalms and hymns. Between these prayers you work. Perhaps you labor in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts with careful precision. Your hands shake slightly from cold, making the work harder. Ink freezes if you're not careful, and you've learned to keep the ink pot near a warming pan. The manuscript you're copying is a gospel book, lavishly illuminated with gold leaf and precious pigments. The irony is not lost on you. Spending gold on decorating scripture while people starve outside the monastery walls. Or perhaps your work is in the infirmary, caring for sick brothers. There are more sick than usual. Malnutrition weakens the body's defenses, and illnesses that would normally be minor become serious. Several elderly monks have died this winter. Their deaths are recorded in the monastery's necrology with the simple notation Anno Famis, in the year of famine. The midday meal is taken in silence in the refectory, while one brother reads aloud from a religious text. The food is simple: bread, pottage, perhaps a bit of cheese. No meat except on feast days, as the rule requires, though given the circumstances this restriction now feels less like sacrifice and more like necessity. The portions are smaller than they used to be. The abbot has ordered rationing to make the monastery's stores last through winter and into the next season. You notice that some brothers are eating less, pushing food toward others who seem weaker. Small acts of charity within the community, redistribution of scarcity. No one speaks of it. The rule demands silence at meals, but everyone sees. After the meal you might walk the cloisters, that covered walkway that surrounds a central courtyard. In better times this is a place of peaceful meditation, of gentle exercise. Now you walk because moving helps keep you warm, and because the sight of the garden in the courtyard centre, brown and dead, waiting for a spring that seems theoretical, is less depressing when viewed in motion rather than contemplated in stillness. The afternoon brings more work. If you're assigned to the monastery's charity operations, you face the hardest task of all. Each day, people gather at the monastery gates, seeking food. In the first year of the famine, there were dozens. Now there are hundreds. They come from the surrounding villages, from the towns, from the roads where they've been wandering in search of anything to eat. The monastery provides what it can. Bread is distributed, thin soup ladled into bowls that people bring with them or cup in their bare hands. But there is never enough. The supplies that seemed inexhaustible 2 years ago have been revealed as finite. The tithes that usually fill the monastery's granaries have dried up. You cannot tithe what was never harvested. You stand at the gate with your brothers handing out portions, and you look into the faces of the people who received them. Hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs, men who should be in their prime looking like elderly grandfathers, women carrying babies who no longer cry, too weak even for that. Some of them thank you, some are too far gone to speak, some look at you with expressions that are hard to interpret. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else. Resentment, perhaps? Envy? You stand there in your warm habit, well fed by comparison, representing an institution that owns vast lands and impressive buildings, and you hand them a piece of bread that will quiet their hunger for a few hours at most. You try to feel compassion, you pray for them, but you also feel something darker, a kind of helpless guilt, a sense that there is something fundamentally wrong about the situation, but no clear way to fix it. If the monastery gave away all its food, it would help for a few days, perhaps a few weeks. And then the monastery itself would collapse, and there would be no one left to provide even this inadequate charity. After the distribution, you return inside. The gates close, the crowds disperse slowly, reluctantly. You wash your hands and go to Vespers, the evening prayer service. The chapel is darker now, lit only by candles that flicker in the draught. You sing the familiar words, but they sound different lately. Give us this day our daily bread hits differently when you've just seen people for whom daily bread is not a given, but a desperate hope. Deliver us from evil feels less abstract when evil seems manifest in empty fields and empty stomachs. At the evening meal, even simpler than the midday one, the abbot addresses the community. He speaks of perseverance, of faith, of the monastery's duty to maintain its spiritual life even in the face of worldly difficulty. He reminds everyone that the rule was written for hard times as well as easy ones, that their vocation calls them to stability, to remaining at their posts regardless of circumstances. But he also announces new restrictions. The heating of individual cells will be suspended except for the very ill. Candles will be rationed more strictly. The library will be closed during the coldest hours to save on heating costs. And, this causes a stir, the copying of decorative manuscripts will be suspended. Materials are too expensive and the resources can be better used elsewhere. After the meal, in the brief period before Compline, you might find yourself in conversation with your brothers. These conversations are technically a violation of the rule's silence requirements, but the abbot has been lenient lately, understanding that human beings need some outlet for their fears and frustrations. One brother, a young man who entered the monastery only 3 years ago, asks questions that everyone is thinking, but few voice directly. Why has God allowed this? What sin has provoked this punishment? Is the famine a sign of the end times, of approaching apocalypse? An older monk, one who lived through lesser famines decades ago, offers perspective. These things happen, he says. Weather changes, crops fail, people suffer. It's terrible, yes, but it's not unprecedented. It will end eventually. Everything does. But another brother, a scholar who works primarily in the library, has a different view. He's been reading the monastery's chronicles, comparing current conditions to past records. And he's noticed something. The weather has been getting colder for decades, he says. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but measurably. Winters are longer, summers are cooler, growing seasons are shorter. What if this isn't just a temporary bad period? What if the climate itself is changing? The conversation grows heavy, no one has answers. So you turn instead to smaller, more immediate concerns. Someone mentions that Brother Thomas has been struggling with illness, needs prayers. Someone else notes that the roof of the western dormitory is leaking, needs repair before the next rain. These concrete, solvable problems are almost comforting after contemplating the larger, unsolvable ones. The bell rings for Compline, the final prayer of the day. You return to the chapel one last time. The service is brief, focused on commending the day's work to God and asking for peaceful rest. When it ends, the great silence begins. From now until morning prayers, no words are to be spoken except in emergency. You return to your cell. It is very cold now. You undress quickly, putting on a heavier nightshirt, and climb into bed, pulling the blankets tight around you. Through your window you can see stars. The clouds have cleared, which means tomorrow will be even colder. You lie in the darkness, trying to pray, trying to sleep, but your mind wanders back to the faces at the gate. You think about the theological paradox you face. The Church teaches that wealth is dangerous, that poverty is blessed, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to the poor. And yet, here you are, in relative comfort, while those blessed poor are dying outside. Perhaps the answer is that monasticism itself is a kind of poverty. Poverty of choice, of freedom, of worldly ambition. You've given up the possibility of family, of property, of self-determination. You've submitted to the rule, to the community, to a life of obedience and routine. Surely that counts for something, but even as you think this, you know it's a rationalization. Your poverty is chosen and comfortable. Theirs is imposed and deadly. The difference matters. Sleep comes eventually, fitfully. You wake several times in the night, too cold to rest deeply. Each time you recite prayers quietly, using the familiar words to calm your mind, to push away the uncomfortable questions that have no comfortable answers. Morning will come. The bell will ring. The cycle will begin again. Prayer, work, charity, prayer, work, charity, endlessly repeating. The monastery will endure because that is what monasteries do. They provide continuity, they maintain tradition, they preserve knowledge and prayer through whatever storms the world throws at them. But you wonder sometimes what the purpose is. All this prayer, all this accumulated wisdom, all this carefully maintained order, what good does it do in the face of simple physical reality? Can prayer grow grain? Can manuscripts feed the hungry? Can the rule of Saint Benedict hold back the rain? You don't know. And in the cold darkness of your cell, that not knowing is perhaps the hardest thing to bear. As years pass and the famine slowly loosens its grip, the social structure of Europe emerges fundamentally changed. The relationship between lord and peasant, between church and people, between the powerful and the powerless, has been tested and found wanting. Trust has frayed, the comfortable certainties of the old order have cracked. Some lords emerge from the crisis with their power intact, having managed their resources wisely, having shown enough charity to maintain loyalty without bankrupting themselves. Others find their authority evaporated, their lands empty, their wealth depleted, their ability to command obedience gone. Some monasteries survive and even strengthen, their charitable works earning them renewed support and donations. Others barely hang on, their buildings falling into disrepair, their communities shrunk, their missions unclear in a world that seems to have moved past them. The famine will be remembered differently depending on who does the remembering. For the nobility, it becomes a story of survival, of maintaining order through crisis, of their own resilience. For the church, it becomes a story of testing and faith, of God's mysterious purposes being worked out through suffering. For common people, though fewer of their voices survive in the historical record, it becomes simply a memory of hunger, a benchmark against which all future hardships will be measured. But perhaps the most important change is the one that happens quietly in countless individual hearts and minds. The certainty that the social order is divinely ordained and permanent begins to weaken. If lords cannot protect their people from starvation, what exactly is the nobility for? If the church, with all its lands and wealth, cannot prevent such suffering, what does that say about its claims to spiritual authority? If God allows the innocent to starve by the thousands, what does that say about divine justice? These are dangerous questions, and in the aftermath of the famine, most people will not voice them openly. But the questions are there, quiet and persistent, like seeds buried in cold ground, waiting for the right conditions to grow. The world that emerges from the Great Famine is one that has learned hard lessons about the fragility of prosperity, the limits of power, and the thin line that separates civilization from catastrophe. It is a world that will, in time, face even greater challenges: plague, war, social upheaval. But for now, as the weather slowly stabilizes and harvests gradually improve, it is simply a world trying to remember how to hope. Let that thought settle over you now like a blanket. The struggles of those distant winters are over. The hunger has passed, the cold has retreated. Centuries of slow progress separate you from those hard times. You lie in warmth and safety, your belly full, your future reasonably secure. The nobility in their halls, the monks in their cells, the peasants in their cottages, all are gone now, returned to the dust from which we all come. Their struggles are finished, their pain has ended. Only the memory remains preserved in chronicles and bones, in abandoned villages and mass graves, in the quiet record that the earth keeps of all who walk upon it. And you can honor their memory simply by recognizing it, by understanding that your comfort is built on centuries of others' labor and suffering, by appreciating what you have while it lasts, by treating the fragile systems that feed and shelter you with appropriate care. But these are thoughts for waking hours. For now, let them drift away. Let the image of those frozen fields fade into the darkness behind your eyes. Let the sounds of those hungry winters quiet into silence. You are warm, you are safe. You are here now in a time when the cold is temporary and hunger is distant, and winter always, eventually, ends. Let that be enough. Let yourself rest. And so we come to the end of our journey through winter's long hold on medieval Europe. We have walked through frozen villages and stone halls, through hastily dug graves and monastery gates. We have felt the cold, tasted the hunger, witnessed the slow erosion of certainty that defined an age. But every winter, no matter how long, eventually releases its grip. The year 1322 brings something that has been absent for so long it feels almost miraculous, a normal spring. The rains, when they come, are gentle rather than torrential. They fall in the right amounts at the right times, nurturing rather than drowning. The sun appears with increasing frequency, warming the soil, coaxing it back to life. Imagine that first truly warm day after 7 years of cold. Imagine stepping outside and feeling genuine warmth on your face, not the weak and watery light that has passed for sunshine during the famine years, but real, strong, life-giving heat. Imagine seeing the first green shoots pushing up through soil that has been barren for so long. Imagine hearing birdsong, proper birdsong, full and loud and joyful, instead of the thin, sparse chirping of half-starved birds. The change doesn't happen overnight. Recovery is slow, tentative, fragile. The first harvests after the famine are modest, the seed stock is depleted, the workforce diminished, the fields exhausted. But they are harvests nonetheless. Grain grows, it ripens, it is cut and threshed and stored, and for the first time in years, there is enough. Not plenty, not yet, but enough. Villages that survived begin to breathe again. Markets reopen. Merchants start to travel the roads with goods to trade. Mills that had gone silent for lack of grain begin to turn again, their wheels creaking back to life, grinding flour for bread that people can actually afford to buy. In the manors and monasteries, the wealthy cautiously expand their meals again. The rationing eases. Servants are hired to replace those who died or fled. The routines of normal life, so disrupted by the long crisis, gradually reassert themselves. But the world that emerges from the Great Famine is not quite the same as the one that entered it. The population is smaller, the social fabric is frayed, and most importantly, the unquestioned assumptions that held medieval society together have been exposed as more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. People have learned that kings cannot command the weather, that lords cannot always protect their subjects, that the church's prayers do not guarantee God's favor, that prosperity can vanish as quickly as rain can fall, and that the thin margin between survival and catastrophe is thinner than anyone had imagined. These lessons will echo through the decades that follow. When the Black Death arrives in 1347, just a generation after the famine ends, it will find a population already weakened, already disillusioned, already aware of how quickly the normal order can collapse. The plague will kill even more than the famine did, and together these two catastrophes will reshape European civilization in ways that are still visible today. But that is a story for another night. For now, let us simply rest in the knowledge that the long winter ended, that life found a way to continue, that humans proved once again their remarkable ability to endure. As you lie there now, in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room, with food in your kitchen and water at your tap, take a moment to consider the distance you've traveled tonight. Not just through time, though we've crossed 7 centuries, but through understanding. You've felt what it was like to wake in a frozen cottage with nothing to eat but thin gruel. You've witnessed a king's helplessness before forces beyond his control. You've seen the bones of the forgotten dead speaking their silent truths from beneath the earth. You've tasted the guilty comfort of noble halls and monastery cells while others starved outside the walls. These are not easy truths. They're not meant to be. But they're important truths because they remind us of something fundamental, that the comfort and security we enjoy are not natural states of being. They are achievements, hard-won over centuries of struggle, built on the accumulated knowledge and labor of countless generations who came before us. The people of the Great Famine did not have weather forecasts. They could not import food from across the globe when local harvests failed. They had no understanding of climate patterns or agricultural science. They faced their crisis with only the tools their time provided: faith, community, and stubborn persistence. And they survived. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough to rebuild, to replant, to continue the long chain of human existence that stretches from their time to ours. You are here because they endured, because someone in that frozen village chose to wake up one more time, to ration the grain one more day, to survive one more winter, because some lord managed his resources well enough to protect at least some of his people, because some monk kept copying manuscripts even when ink froze and fingers cramped, preserving knowledge for future generations. Their struggles, their suffering, their small victories and devastating defeats, all of it flows forward through time, river-like, carrying us along, shaping the world we inherit. Let yourself drift now. Let the images from tonight's journey begin to fade, softening at the edges, becoming less distinct. The frozen fields blur into darkness. The stone halls dissolve like morning mist. The bones beneath the frost sink back into the quiet earth where they rest. What remains is not the suffering itself, that is long past, long resolved, but the knowledge that humans can face almost unimaginable hardship and still find ways to continue. That spring always follows winter, even when winter seems eternal. That hope, even when irrational, even when unsupported by evidence, is sometimes the most important tool we possess. Think of those first green shoots pushing through the cold soil in 1322. Think of how impossible they must have seemed after 7 years of failure. Think of the farmers who planted those seeds despite having every reason to believe they would fail again. Think of their courage, not the loud courage of battle, but the quiet courage of trying one more time when all previous attempts have ended in disappointment. That courage is available to you too. Whatever struggles you face in your own time, whatever challenges await in your own life, remember that humans have faced worse and survived. That resilience is your inheritance, passed down through the generations, written into your very DNA by ancestors who refused to give up even when surrender seemed the only rational choice. But these are thoughts to consider tomorrow in daylight, when you're awake and alert. For now, let them go. Let everything go. The history lesson is over. The journey through the past is complete. You've done your traveling for tonight. Your breathing is slowing now, deep and easy, like waves on a gentle shore. In and out, steady and calm. The weight of your body presses into the mattress, and the mattress supports you completely. You don't have to hold yourself up. You don't have to stay alert. You can simply rest. The temperature of your room is exactly right. Not too hot, not too cold, just perfect, comfortable, safe. You are wrapped in warmth, surrounded by softness, protected from the elements by walls and windows and all the accumulated technology of modern civilization. No frozen ground beneath you, no damp straw mattress, no hunger gnawing at your belly, no cold seeping through inadequate walls. None of the hardships we've explored tonight touch you here. They are past, they are distant, they are finished. What remains is peace, quiet, the gentle darkness behind your eyelids, the slow drift towards sleep that needs no effort, no forcing, no trying, just letting go. 700 years ago, after a day of scraping by on almost nothing, someone else lay down to sleep. They were cold, they were hungry, they were afraid. But they slept anyway, because sleep is a gift that comes even to the suffering. Even in the hardest times, the body knows how to rest. And how much easier is your rest? How much softer your bed? How much safer your sleep? Let that comfort sink deep into your bones. Let it settle into your muscles, releasing any remaining tension. Let it quiet your thoughts, slowing the endless chatter of the mind to a whisper, then to silence. The Great Famine is over. The long winter has ended. Spring came, as it always does, and night comes too, as it always does, bringing with it the blessed gift of sleep. You don't have to do anything now. You don't have to solve any problems or answer any questions. You don't have to think about tomorrow or remember yesterday. You can simply be here, in this moment, in this darkness, in this quiet. The world will still be there in the morning. History will still be waiting, patient and endless, ready to tell more stories when you're ready to hear them. But tonight's story is told. Tonight's journey is complete. And so we leave those frozen fields behind. We bid farewell to Edward in his cold palace, to the bones in their quiet graves, to the nobles in their halls and the monks in their cells. We thank them for their lessons and release them back to the past where they belong. What remains is just you, just this moment, just the soft darkness and the gentle pull of sleep. Let it take you now. Don't fight it. Don't resist. Just drift, like snow falling on a winter night, soft and silent and peaceful, like ice melting in spring, slow and inevitable and right, like time itself, flowing forward, carrying you along, taking you exactly where you need to go, into sleep, into rest, into dreams that may be sweet or may be nothing at all. It doesn't matter. What matters is the letting go, the releasing, the surrendering to the natural rhythm of consciousness fading into unconsciousness. You are safe, you are warm, you are comfortable, and you are, even now, even as these words fade away, beginning to sleep deeper and deeper into the quiet night, where history rests alongside you, where the past and present meet in dreams, where winter and spring are just stories, and morning is still far away, so far away, and sleep is here, right now, taking you gently, softly, down into rest. Good night, quiet traveler. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your morning, when it comes, be warm with the light of a sun that never fails to rise. The winter that erased a kingdom is over, but your own rest is just beginning.